Very little happens until we pick up pocket fours at 455, we're in for 1800 by this point and have 1700 in front of us. Under the gun limps in, the hijack calls, the cutoff raises to 50. I call, the big blind calls, under the gun calls, the hijack folds, we're going 4 ways to the flop out of position, it comes queen 4-3 rainbow, we've got middle set with multiple opponents, unfortunately, it checks through. The turn is the 5 of hearts, there's more and more to be worried about on this board, we can't allow it to check through again. I bet 130. The big blind and under the gun fold, our last hope is the initial pre-flop raiser in the cutoff. She calls. It's tough to put her on a hand after she checked back the flop, she may just have a draw. The river is the 9 of diamonds, it's about as blank as it gets on this board. My opponent is a solid player who doesn't bluff frequently. If she did bluff a lot, I might check to induce a bet from missed draws. Fairly often, I'll have missed draws, and I'll fire a big river bet with air. Here I make it 550 as a slight overbet to balance the times when I'm bluffing. If my opponent checks back a queen on the flop for pot control, or even if she has a hand like pocket jacks, she still might be able to find a call. The cutoff doesn't think it over for too long before folding. She likely didn't have much, perhaps she bricked a straight draw, heart draw, or both. With this win, we're up about 250 on the day. About a half hour later, we've got ace deuce offsuit in the big blind, the button raises to 30. The small blind has something he wants to play with, he calls. In theory, ace deuce offsuit is supposed to be a fold when the button raises and the small blind calls. The worst offsuit ace you're supposed to call with in this scenario is ace 4 offsuit. We're not too far from that, and we didn't come all this way to Bellagio to fold. I'd call for 20 more. We're going 3 ways to the flop. It's ace 6-3 with 2 hearts. We've got top pair and no kicker. The small blind leads for 40, putting us in an interesting spot. This is why you don't play ace deuce offsuit. Not only do we have to be concerned that the small blind has us beat, but the pre-flop raiser on the button may have us beat as well. Still, we're not folding top pair yet. I call hoping that we see a fold from the button. Luckily, the button lays down her hand. We're now heads up in position. The turn is another 6. This slows the small blind down. He checks. I want to take control of this pot. I make a small bet of 70. This accomplishes 2 things. First, it charges the small blind if he has a heart draw. Second, it allows us to check back the river if the small blind happens to have a better ace. Let's say the small blind has ace 10 for example, and the river is an offsuit 7. If we checked back turn, the small blind may realize that he has the best hand and could bet something like 80 or 100 on the river. I'd feel inclined to call, and I'd lose more than our $70 bet. The small blind calls, I still feel like he has hearts or a not so strong ace. The river is the king of diamonds. I'm happy to see it because it means that we no longer have to worry about our kicker not playing. If the opponent has an ace, we'll be chopping the majority of the time unless he has ace 6. I doubt he'd ever have ace king though. The small blind puts out a blocker bet of 100. I strongly suspect that we'll both be playing aces and 6s with a king. I don't feel like calling to win half the pot. Since we bet turn, we can still have strong hands in our range like full houses and trip 6s. I raised to 350 in order to rep those. Now if the opponent has something like ace 10, he's in a very difficult spot. From our perspective, the worst case scenario is that he calls and we split the pot like we normally would have if we called anyway. The best case scenario is he folds a chop, so we win an extra couple hundred. The player folds somewhat quickly. Maybe he had a king-high flush draw and bet small on the river to get a showdown cheaply. Maybe our play worked to get the opponent off of an ace. Either way, we're up over 500. Another half hour goes by when we pick up Jack 10 offsuit in the small blind. A player in middle position raises to 30. He's someone that I've known for years who does a lot of unorthodox things when he gets bored, including open jamming for several hundred and sometimes blind. He recently tripled up after jamming for about 300 with pocket 4s and got called by king queen and ace king. His opponents didn't make a pair, so he scooped. The middle position player is someone who I typically go out of my way for to get involved. The hijack calls the pre-flop raise, the button calls. Normally, I'd fold Jack 10 offsuit in this situation. Here, I call for 25 more. The big blind calls, we're going 5 ways to the flop. It's 10-6-6 with 2 hearts. We connect pretty well with this one. It checks through. Jack 10 might be winning at the moment. The turn is the 8 of diamonds. We've got to start betting before more scary cards come out like hearts, diamonds, a 9, or any overcards. I make it 70. Taking down the pot with this bet would be a good result. The big blind folds. The initial pre-flop raiser calls. The hijack calls. The button folds. It's down to 3 players. The river is the 8 of spades. If my opponent had draws on the turn, they missed. If they had something like 9-8 or 8-7, they just made a full house though. I check for pot control purposes and to potentially induce a bluff from the middle position player. He comes through with a bet of 160. this is the wild guy, I'm not putting much stock into his bet. I'm more concerned about the hijack. If the hijack calls, I'll get out of the hand. Instead, the hijack folds. Easy decision for me against the other opponent. I call. We don't have the winner.
Nice hand.
The opponent makes runner full house with ace-8 offsuit. I expanded the pre-flop calling range and got punished for it. There's no right way to play jiggity-tiggity. I'm down a little for the day when we're dealt pocket tens. It's my first hand at a new table. I switched to hang out with my friend Kevin, who's on my right. He raises from under the gun to 30. He'll be playing a tight range. If we were both in later position, I'd 3-bet at a high frequency. When he's first to act and I'm second to act, I'll be calling most of the time, which is what I do here. The big blind calls. We're going 3 ways to the flop in position. It's 10-5-3 with 2 diamonds. We've got top set. The big blind checks. Kevin makes slightly more than a pot-sized bet of 100. Wow. We've got position on him and don't want to scare him off. I call, even though there are plenty of bad cards that could come out on future streets. The big blind looks like he wants to do something crazy. His name is Ryan. I've never played with him before. Ultimately, he just flats. We're all still in it. The turn is the 9 of diamonds. I don't like seeing the flush draw get there, especially because most of the 10s are accounted for and we have 2 opponents. If we had bottom set, another diamond would be less worrisome because it'd be a lot more likely that one or both opponents could have top pair. The big blind checks. Under the gun checks. I doubt I have to worry about under the gun having a flush because he would have continued betting for value rather than potentially let it check through with 2 opponents. I don't want this board to get any worse. I bet 240 so that no one gets a free river card in the instances when we are ahead. If we get check raised by a flush, we still have full house outs as well. The big blind folds. He's the one that I was most concerned about. My friend Kevin also folds. I show him that he made a good laydown. I'm a little surprised to hear when he tells me exactly how good it was though.
Did you? Nice laydown.
With several dynamics at play, Kevin is smart enough to know that I'll almost never be bluffing when the flush draw gets there on the turn. After he makes a pot-sized bet on the flop, I call and the big blind calls. The fact that we're both in early position decreases the chances even more so. We look down at ace-deuce of clubs and are currently slightly stuck after trying to bluff into the nuts and a future full house. We're in the cutoff and Ryan's put the double straddle on to 40. I raise to 100. The player who just got stacked with the flop straight, his rebot, got a quick double up, and is currently in the small blind. He 3-bets to 340. There's 5-10 in the pot. I'm getting over 2-1 in position with the suited ace. We're in another one of these spots in which I should typically be folding ace-deuce, but ace-3 and ace-4 suited are going to be calls against a small blind 3-bet. The opponent's sizing is a lot less than 4x here too, so I can justify expanding since I'm getting a better price. I call for 240 more. We're heads up in position in what's already a big pot. The flop comes jack 6-4 with 2 clubs. We've got a draw to the nuts with 1 over and a backdoor straight draw as well. The small blind down bets at 240. I've got 1190 total in my stack and there's 990 in the pot at the moment. If I call, the pot will be 1230 and I'll have 950 left. I'm getting a good price on a call. The problem is that if I call here, we brick turn and the opponent shoves, I'm gonna have to fold. I really like realizing my equity, so I don't like folding much, especially when I have a draw to the nuts. I also really like winning hands without making a pair. The idea comes into my head to rip it in as a semi-bluff. I can likely get all better ace-high hands to fold, maybe something like 10s and 9s as well. There aren't any hands that would be really a disaster for us to be up against if the opponent calls. Even if the small blind has pocket kings, we'll still have a 46% chance of winning. I'm in the gambling mood. Let's do this. That's right, we're all in and there's no snap call, despite the opponent getting about 2.3 to 1 pot odds. A fold would be a huge victory for us. The opponent only needs to have 30% equity to break even by calling. It's hard to imagine he doesn't have at least that with anything that he would have 3-bet us with pre-flop, followed by a c-bet. We're definitely not up against an overpair, likely not even up against a jack. After 30 seconds, the opponent folds. We win a fairly large pot with no pair. Part of me wishes that we would have gotten called because I've got a feeling that we were going to get there. A bigger part of me that is rational is happy that the opponent laid his hand down. We're up a few hundred on the session.